Okay, we're back with hour 2. Maybe someone might gently want to, oh, no. Good morning, you're back. So we've got our model set up. So now we want our controller to talk to it. So we're going to modify our existing store page. When we click on store, instead of hard coding this list, we want this list instead to come out of the genres table from our database. If we want to see what's in it, I can easily just go to my Server Explorer over here. And if I open up my default connection and expand my tables, we can have a look. If I right-click my genre table, I can just choose Show Table Data, and it will actually show us the contents of that table without us even having to write a simple query. Probably would have made my life easier to use my local database. It would run more quickly. So we have 10 genres each with an ID, a name, and a description. So we want to use our genre model to query this table, pull out the data, and then pass that data off to our view. So let's open up our store controller. And we're going to change the index view. If I open up my views, store, and index. Right now, our store just says browse, which takes us off to this page. We want to list all the genres right here on the index page. So in our store controller, in our index view, we will connect to the database. We're going to use this kind of neat feature that we saw in the video we watched. If we have a using statement, that will open our connection and then automatically close it when we're done without an explicit close connection statement. So we'll type the word using, and in here, if I type models dot, here's my connection model. So we're going to create a new by having, I don't need the using statement. We could just write that code as one line, starting with models and ending with those round brackets. But then we explicitly need to close the connection when we're done. By wrapping it in this using command, that means create and open the connection here. But as soon as that curly brace ends, drop the connection and close it. So we're actually going to move all of our code inside. So we're connected using our default connection class we just generated. So now we're going to write our query, and this is same kind of query we wrote when we used web forms. It's no different. It's all still using the entity framework. So I'll just create a variable And now we'll just use our model, our genres model. And if we call dot list, this runs a select query that gets all the records, all the rows, and all the columns in the genres table. Now we could pass filters to this if we want to only get some of them. We could order it. For example, for now we'll just get all the genres. So that's a heck of a lot easier than writing an SQL, having to write a query. So what would we do? So now our genres local variable, when this line finishes executing, we're going to have a bunch of data in it. So how do we get this data out of our controller and hand that data off to our view? We could use the view bag, but there's a more efficient way of doing it. Doug? Yeah, when we load the view, let's also, as a parameter, right now our view takes no parameters, no information is passed when we load the view. We can pass this as a parameter here. So load the view and pass it. So when we load the view, we're also handing it all of the data that the view needs. So the controller is really the go-between here. The data sits in the database. The models access the database directly. But the controller just points to a model, says, hey, get me this. The model gets that, gives it back to the controller, and the controller says to the user interface, okay, here you go. Here's the data. So the controller's kind of like the server in the restaurant. I gave you this analogy about a year ago when we talked about PHP, right? How the user requests something in their browser, and we use the server-side script to go and run to the database, fetch it, pull it out, and give it back. So that's the controller. It's really doing most of the heavy lifting here. So it's got a model over here for fetching the data. It's got a view over here for displaying the data in our UI layer. So our controller should be good. And as soon as this curly brace, because we have this using statement around our connection, the using statement means the connection only exists while those lines execute. Once they're done, the connection gets closed, which is better for server performance. We don't leave those database connections open any longer than they need to be. So we've built our model. We've got our controller using that model to run a query, fetching data, and want to send it back to the view. So now we need to modify our index view. So we're going to do a couple of things on here. The first thing we're going to have to do, we'll maybe see it here. Actually, I think we'll see it here. Is we're going to need to tell our view, right? Our view is receiving data in, so we need to set up the view to receive that data. We basically need to declare a model for our view, so our view knows that there's data coming in from the controller. So in our view up at the top, I'm going to get rid of, actually, sorry, we can leave that. That's fine. But what we want to do up here is declare a model for our view. And it's a particular type of model. This view is receiving, right? What's it receiving? It's getting a list of data. So there's a keyword we haven't really talked about in ASP.NET. You're going to see it a lot, and maybe some of you may have wondered what it means. Because this is a list, in the .NET framework, Microsoft has this class called IEnumerable, which basically is a fancy way of saying it's a list. Okay. So we want to declare that our model, what we're sending in from the view, is IEnumerable. Enumerable means we can loop through it, that it's a collection or a list of related objects, is a simple way of thinking about it. And it uses this syntax, these angled brackets. So IEnumerable, so it's a collection of related items. And now we have to define what type of items we're passing in. So this is what's coming into our view. This is what the controller is handing to it. A list of items in our genre class. So it knows this is what we're getting. But not just one, we're getting a list of them. And that's being passed in right here on line 21. That's our parameter when we call return view. So now our view knows when it loads, it knows what to expect, what kind of data is being handed to it. So let's create an unordered list. And now we'll use our loop. We used a loop last week. Right? We used an for each to loop through the data. So we're doing something pretty similar here, although instead of just pulling the data here, our data is coming in from our model. In this case, we're looping through the list that's passed in, which is our model. I'll just open curly braces. I'm going to move my LIs inside here. Inside here, we want to show the genre we may have to change something here. We should have gotten a code prompt here, which we didn't. My project's not called MVC Music Store. That's the problem. Should be week 12. We have to play with this a little bit. Let's see what happens. So I'll compile my solution and we'll try it out. I'm a little skeptical because we should be getting a list of properties here of genre, and Visual Studio is not giving us this code prompt. We'll try it anyway. Sometimes our error messages will help us. So now when I click Store, Okay, well, Visual Studio deceived me. I'm not sure what getting my code prompt here. We should. So let's run this through the debugger and kind of see what happens. I thought I started my debugger. Oh. So we can kind of walk through this and see what's happening, how this is put together. So when I click my store link, so my database connection is null until line 15 runs. So now it creates a new connection using my connection string. Sets up the rules for my model. Gets the list of genres. Tells me I have 10, and we can actually inspect the data here. So there's my first one. And then it passes that query result that has 10 records, passes that to our view. It loads our layout file first. And then it loops through our genre model one at a time. And we'll output each value. So there's our list. I'm somewhat surprised I didn't get the code hinting in my view in Visual Studio. I'm not entirely sure why I didn't. Well, now it recognizes it. Interesting. Now when I mouse over, when I coded it at first, it didn't, but notice my red line's gone away. It now recognizes the name property. Maybe I just had to build my solution. And now when I click the dot, it recognizes the properties of our genre model. So if we wanted to output, say, the ID or the description, we have name, description. We also have the list of albums that are attached because the genre and the albums are related. Now our list doesn't look great from a UI perspective. What's wrong with this list? Other than that it doesn't, in fact, doesn't look beautiful. From a usability, how would you change that list? Okay, yeah, we'll want to be able to make them links so someone can choose one of those and then see the albums within that. We're going to do that in a minute. So we want to make them links. What else would you do with a list that looks like this? What's wrong with it from a usability perspective? If, let's say, this list gets a lot longer. Yep. What else could you do to make this list easier to read? We could make it as a table. We could, although we only have one item. We could do it as a drop down. Jacob, what do you think? We could. what about, what order is the data presented in? I'll give you a really big hint. Brad, what would you do? Yeah, why don't we make it alphabetical? What order is this being displayed in right now? Yeah, it's probably based on, if we look in our Server Explorer, right? It's probably just based on those are the ID numbers. If we don't specify any kind of order, when we call to list on a model, we're going to get the data in whatever order it's entered in the database, right? Sequentially by the ID number, which doesn't always make sense. If we're not displaying the ID numbers, we don't want to display them. Those values aren't useful to our users, right? We want to display them by our name, by the name. So we can modify this a bit. Let's modify our controller so we don't need to change anything in our view, right? We're still just going to loop through whatever is passed, but we want to change the controller. So rather than passing a list sorted by the ID number, we're passing a list sorted by the name instead. There are a few different ways of doing it. What we'll do is we'll just create a second list where we take the first list and resort it. It's possible to write a sort function here. The syntax is complicated, so I'm going to do it this simpler way. It's probably better for performance that way, but since this is the first time we'll do it, we'll do something that will seem a little easier to read and maybe make a little more sense. So we will create a list sorted by name. Instead of passing in the original list, let's resort that query result and send the sorted list instead. I'll maybe just call this one genres AZ. So we know it's coming in that order. So we're going to take this list and we're going to add an order by function to it. We want to order by the name column ascending. It's like writing an order by clause in an SQL query. So G is representing the original list. We're basically giving it an alias so we can sort by the name column in the original list. So we're kind of taking, we have that first list sorted by ID. We're making a copy of it, in effect, with that order by clause. It may not be the most efficient, but it's a little cleaner to read than doing it the messy way, at least for now. So now, which of these two lists should we pass to the view? The original list, which is this one, or the new list, which is this one? Yeah, we may as well pass the new list. We shouldn't have to change anything in our view, right? Because our view, all we've told it here is that the list coming in is a list of genre elements. We haven't given it a specific name, so we don't have to change. We shouldn't have to modify anything in the view. Our view just knows a list of genres is being supplied. We could pass it with any name. So we'll just want to build the solution because we modified our controller. So we've changed the logic. in the controller. Whoops. Okay, I have to kick off my server again because I started debugging and then I stopped, which shuts the server off. So now our view is showing our ordered list instead. I mean, I think there is an order by in here. But yeah, we need to write a different kind of expression in order to get that to work. You wanted to try and play around with that. If I'm going too slow for you, you can try that as a challenge. How do we do it without that second list? We could order just the first list. We just have this static list now. A user can see the items in our list, but they can't do anything with them. Just saying, hey, here's our store. Here are the categories of product we have. And you can look at those categories. You can't do anything. Isn't that terribly useful? So we probably want to make these links as well. So we want to change it so that when this page loads, not only do we have this ordered list, like say this one, but they're links, and when we click on one of them, it will take us to the browse view called the browse function. We're going to pass in the genre. We did this a couple weeks ago, and then we'll show all of the albums that are attached to that genre. So if I pick a different genre, I get different data. Okay, so this list, so we're going to do a similar thing on this page, except we're using an HTML table rather than a list because we've got multiple values. And we're filtering it. We're not showing all the albums in the database. We're only showing the related albums based on the value we pass in here. We want to add this functionality. Questions so far before we do that? So let's go back to our index view. So we want to wrap these genre names inside of links. So in here, we'll use an @HTML action link. We used these the last couple of weeks. So the first parameter here, we're actually inside server-side tags, so I can take out the @ symbol here. We don't need the @ symbol inside of an @ symbol. So that's our first parameter. What's the text of the link? Well, we want the link text to show the name of each value. Second parameter is what is the name of the action in the controller clicking the link is going to call. So we want it to call our browse link. Now, because this view is already part of the store, we don't actually have to name the controller. If we don't name a controller here, it knows to use the same controller that loaded this view. So if this view is loaded by the store controller, if we don't specify which controller the browse action to run, it will run it in the same one, which is store. But we do need to pass in a parameter here. We don't just want to call browse. We have to give it browse some information. So print out the name of the genre, make it a link to our browse function, and pass in that name on the end of the link. So we're basically setting up like a query string. So our URL will say genre equals rock, or genre equals jazz, genre equals pop. Let's just try this and see what happens, the syntax. So they are links, so that's good. They look like links. And if we look down in the status bar, I think we formatted them properly. So we can see as I mouse over them that the correct genre name is added on to the end of that link. So if I just click one of these for a minute. So this word here where it says genre, that's what we're specifying right here. What is the name of the key or the variable name that we're passing? And this part is what value are we giving to that variable? Well, the same value, this value is going to match this one. If the link says rock, the value we're passing is rock. If the link says jazz, the value we're passing is jazz. So I should be able to click any one of them, and the name of that genre is passed along to the next page. So now we'll need to deal with this page. So our index view is basically done. We've queried the database, we've sorted the data, we've displayed it in some kind of useful way, and then we're allowing our user to navigate through the site using very little HTML. So you can see how, and our Razor views, our syntax is designed to be this way. So that we have a very small HTML footprint, which means less coding, less bandwidth, less load time for users. So our views are going to be as light as possible this way. So now we want to change this function. Browse, we're going to have to make a bunch of changes here. What things do we need to do inside of this function? Because when the user clicks on any genre of music now, it's going to call that function. So very little here are we going to be able to keep. What things will we have to do within here? What's one thing we're going to have to change that you can see? Either add, change, or remove from lines 32 to 39. Devin? Okay, so we'll get rid of the array. What are we going to replace that with? Yeah, so we're going to need to connect to the database instead and run a query. Which model are we going to use for the query? So we've got, let's look at our models. We've got album, artist, and genre. We want our page to show this. So where is this data coming from, if you look at it? Yeah, so we want to show a list of albums. So we're going to need to replace this hard-coded list of genres with a database connection and a query using a model that gets a list of albums. What else will we have to change here? So line 35, we're just going to get rid of that entirely. What other changes do we need to make in this function? Oh. You got it. Thank you, Gurbesh. So we're not going to use the view bag at all. We don't need it. But whatever query result we get, when we call return view, just like we did here, we'll pass that to the view as well. So let's start by getting rid of this. There's one more change we need to make. So all those things that you mentioned, we're going to have to do all of them. We're going to have to connect. We're going to have to run a query. We're going to get rid of the view bag. We're going to pass the query results to our view. One other thing we have to do. Is that? Right. Remember now, when we call this page, we're not just calling browse. Browse has a piece of information coming in. We don't want this page to show all the albums. We only want it to show the albums in the genre the user clicked on. So if they click jazz, we should only be showing the jazz albums. Of this function, how do we tell the function within this code? How do we tell the function what information is coming in? You can actually see it in the function down below, right? Because this function accepts one piece of information, which is what's the genre. Well, we could call it ID. So you're on the right track. It's not really an ID value. What value is being passed in? Yeah, the name, a value called genre. What type of data is it? String. So in our browse function, rather than being empty in the method header, just like on our details, we're going to accept a string called genre. We're calling it genre because that's what our link is passing in. So it's kind of like in PHP, a $_get parameter. So we're not just calling browse and browsing everything. We're browsing, but we need to know which genre are we browsing so we can show the user the data they asked for. And we're hiding everything else. So we'll start there. We'll add this parameter. We'll take this out. And we'll connect to the database. And then we'll take a break and we'll finish this after. So again, we'll have our using command. We'll create a new connection. So we'll connect and disconnect. We'll take out the view bag because we don't need it. And we'll just change move our return view inside. So what we'll do when we come back is we're going to use this genre variable, that string that comes into the method. We'll use our connection. We'll run a query and fetch those results, and we'll pass those results back to the view. Well, at the moment, it would crash. Well, we'd probably wrap this in like in an air handler in a try-catch block. So we could wrap this whole thing. So try that. Catch. So we could do a redirect or load a different view, something like that is how we would do it. I'll just comment that out for now, but that's basically how it would work. Good question. Now I'll just let it fail. All right, so why don't we take a 10-minute pause here, and when we come back, we'll finish writing this method, and then we'll write our view to actually load the list of albums for this view. We may actually wrap up a little bit early today.